Hello and welcome to our media show special debate on the future of the BBC. The BBC's Royal Charter, without which it would not exist, lasts 10 years and is up for renewal. The government has published a green paper detailing 19 questions for public discussion, many of which will no doubt open up during our debate here at the Radio Theatre in London today. But let me paraphrase. What is the point of the BBC? What should it do or not do? How should it be funded? And how should it be governed? All pretty fundamental questions for an institution that started life in 1922 and which, in spite of everything that has changed since, is still here. We'll hear from the Secretary of State, John Whittingdale, and have questions and contributions from our audience. And we have an outstanding panel. Greg Dyke, currently Chairman of the Football Association but Director General of the BBC from 2000 to 2004. Trevor Kavanagh, political columnist and Associate Editor of The Sun newspaper. Liz Forgan, ex of The Guardian, one-time Director of Programmes at Channel 4, former Director of BBC Radio and, until recently, Chair of the Arts Council and the Scott Trust that owns The Guardian. Richard Eyre is a senior member of the BBC's Governing Trust. He was formerly a senior BBC News executive and a member of Ofcom's Content Board. And James Pennell was a Labour MP and Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, no less, and is now the BBC's Director of Strategy and Digital. Your appreciation, please, for our panel. And, of course, at home, you can join the conversation, as they say, on Twitter with the hashtag BBC Future. And, of course, you can email us via the Radio 4 website. But to get us started, what do you, licence payers across the UK, who currently fork out £3.7 billion a year for the privilege, make of the BBC?
I don't think necessarily you have to have TV channels. It could be internet channels.
They plough way too much money in things like EastEnders and, 3-4 times a week is ridiculous because we don't watch it.
To me, the media is very South of England centric, so what's happening at the moment with BBC Scotland and Manchester, Salford and other places, that's a good thing, so more of that.
If you look at a lot of the weather forecasts and things like that, you see if it's raining in London, it's raining everywhere.
I think we could do with less voting out programmes. I'm pretty sick of those, actually. Something a bit new, that's what we need, something new.
I've got no problems with the licence fee as it is. I see the money well spent.
It used to be a licence was for your receiver. You can receive your TV on your phone, your iPad, so it doesn't quite make sense in the way it once did.
There's got to be a way, like over the internet or whatever, that they can tell what you're watching. So it could be like a pay-per-view.
It's only the BBC demand the licence fee. Nobody else does, so I think they should scrap it. And they should have done years ago.
If you're going to provide the sort of service it provides, and it's a wide-ranging service, the cost of that has to be shared. If you had, everybody who had satellite didn't pay for that, then you would have no BBC.
I think if you get too much regulation in things, it dumbs the service down.
Oh, I think they get themselves in a mess sometimes. But I think they get a lot of interference. They get a lot of interference for government bodies, and they should be free from interference with government bodies, in my opinion.
In Parliament and the public presses, meanwhile, there has been a tangible sense that the BBC is under ideological threat. The reinventor of Doctor Who, writer Russell T Davies, said, and I'll quote, "We are standing on a precipice where the BBC is about to fall into a ravine. They," and he means here the Conservative government, "are dead set against the BBC. It's just a fact," he says. But is it true? Is the BBC facing an ideologically motivated threat to its very existence? Our first question, Liz Forgan, what do you make of that proposition?
I've never before believed the notion that the BBC was about to be destroyed by government. It happens, somebody says that every time there's a licence fee renewal. But this time I take it more seriously, and it's not just about the attitude of the government, although that's important. You've got an industry in exceptional turmoil. You've got a weakened BBC Trust. You've got a government which is more focused on the commercial issues than the public good issues around the BBC. And you've got a Secretary of State who absolutely knows this subject backwards and has a real point of view. And I think those things together mean quite a dangerous situation for the BBC.
Trevor Kavanagh?
Well, I think the BBC is paranoid, and that doesn't mean that they're not out to get you. But I do think that you overstate what the government of the day intends to do and what it has in mind for the BBC. I think there are justifiable reasons for thinking that it's too big, that its reach is too wide, and that it is an unstoppable monopoly. It is so big that it's crowding out private investment in local radio and all sorts of other areas of broadcasting. And I think it does have to have a very close look at the way it spends its money. I certainly think the Conservative Party believes that, and I think correctly, that the BBC has an institutional bias, as one of its former Director Generals said. And although he and others have said that that was a long time ago, if you are actually having to hold classes for broadcast journalists on how to be impartial about the European Union issue, then I think there's still a long way to go on that.
OK, Richard Eyre.
I don't think there's an ideological threat. I think this government is asking the same sort of questions in its Green Paper about the future of the BBC as previous governments have asked, and the sort of questions that should be asked, and the BBC should be able to answer them. I think there is a growing tendency, not just with this government, but with governments over many years now, to increasingly regard the BBC as a bit of government property. Well, it isn't government property. It doesn't belong to governments or to politicians or to Parliament. It belongs to the licence fee payers. And that's why it's particularly important that there's been a massive response so far from licence fee payers to tell us directly and to tell government directly what they want the BBC to do.
Greg Dyke, BBC under threat.
I think there's a degree of threat, but I think there's a danger of exaggerating it. Although I think there's a lot of huff and puff around, we've got to see whether it's real yet. That doesn't mean to say that those who want to sustain the BBC don't have to be prepared to fight if it comes.
OK. I'll come to James Pennell in a minute, but first, what does the Secretary of State John Whittingdale say? Well, I asked him if he was surprised at the BBC's reaction to the government's Green Paper, which essentially said that the Green Paper, in and of itself, was a recipe for a diminished BBC.
Well, I have to say that I was somewhat surprised by what seemed to be a degree of hysteria in the initial response, not necessarily from the BBC, but from a number of their supporters who they lined up. There was talk about a much diminished BBC and, we need to save the BBC in the next 24 hours, which I could not see on what possible grounds people were suggesting that the BBC was under that kind of threat.
So would it be fair to say, then, that there is no ideologically motivated assault on the BBC's core, as far as you're aware?
Absolutely not. I mean, I've always made it clear that actually I support public service broadcasting, and I think there is a role for a publicly funded broadcaster to complement the commercial channels.
When you say, and as you said at the RTS, you've just said again, that there is precisely no prospect of the BBC being abolished, do you think the BBC were tilting at windmills?
I think there was an element of that. I think it was also unfortunate that the publication of the Green Paper came quite so soon after we'd had to make the announcement about the funding of the over 75 licence fee. But that was as a result of the economic situation. That had nothing to do with any kind of vendetta against the BBC. It's just the economic climate we're currently in.
John Whittingdale, and more from him later. James Pennell, Director of Strategy at the BBC. Do you agree with what he's saying? Do you accept what he's saying?
I think the reason that we made those warnings around the Green Paper is the government had just come and taken a big slab of income out of the BBC, and it looked like they were preparing to come and take another slab from briefing in the papers. And if that were to happen, that would be a genuine diminishing, not an abolishing, but genuine diminishing of the BBC. And I think it's absolutely right to warn about that. What we've seen from the Secretary of State and from various ministers since is a strong commitment to the BBC going forward, which the Secretary of State has just reiterated. And we now look forward to a white paper that really allows us to build on the current success, to have a BBC which, as part of the market, continues to succeed over the next 10 years.
So you don't think that the BBC, in reacting in the way that they did, might have kind of set some hairs running, which are going to be kind of quite hard now to control? I mean, to say that you cried wolf is perhaps understating the case.
No, I totally disagree with that. If a government comes along and says we're going to take £650 million in over 75s licences, we're going to make some ameliorations to that in an agreement, which means that it will be a cut. It will mean tough decisions for us, but it will be a cut of 10%. It then looked like actually that was the start of the story, and they were going to come and take even more.
But you don't see, as we speak, yes or no, if you don't mind, an existential threat?
There's no threat about abolishing the BBC, but I do think the decisions that we take now will determine whether in 10 years' time the BBC continues to be successful. It's not an answer, you can't give a yes or no answer, but the BBC has modernised again and again in its history, as your documentary over the weekend showed, and we have to do so again, and we hope that the White Paper will enable us to do that.
OK, so most people, I think it's fair to say, probably think that the BBC should exist in some form, but what kind of BBC do we need in the modern digital age? An age which really couldn't be a further cry from John Reith's monopoly public service broadcaster of the 1920s. So, what should today's BBC be, and what should it do? The Green Paper asks whether the BBC services are distinctive enough, whether it's too competitive, and whether with its £3.7 billion of guaranteed funding, it isn't crowding out commercial competitors who, left to their own devices, might yet improve services available to we consumers. Well, we have an audience question to get us started.
My name is Sudhir Jananka. I'm an economist by profession, and my question is a little bit different. Why should the BBC stop producing popular programmes with a broad appeal? Would this not undermine its remit to educate, inform and entertain to conifers?
Greg Dyke.
Well, I think the BBC invented what I would call quality popular programming in this country. If you go back in history, you'll find, go back to 1960, the BBC miles behind in the ratings, ITV winning easily, largely playing American programming and quiz shows and the rest of it. And the BBC in the 60s invented British television as we know it today. And I think it would be a terrible mistake for the BBC to go away from not only making often minority programmes aimed at quite small audiences, but to go away from making the Strictly Come Dancing and the rest of the programmes that actually get mass audiences would be a terrible mistake.
I think in fairness, I should say that John Whittingdale also is a self-publicising fan, along with other members of the government of Strictly Come Dancing and the Great British Bake Off. You might wonder why, but they are.
Yeah, but you can't say on the one hand we think there should be less. They're almost saying that making popular programming is easy. Making popular programming is very difficult. Why do so many programmes that are aimed to be popular fail on all channels? It's difficult.
Another word that keeps popping up is universality, the idea that the BBC should be making programmes for everybody. Is that an appropriate principle, do you think, in the modern age?
That is the deal. The licence fees paid by everybody, so the BBC provides something of quality and exceptionalness for everybody. When I used to run the radio, the centre of my strategy was to hang on at all costs to Radios 1 and 2. The ability of the BBC to serve those popular audiences with exceptional quality and extraordinary range that the market would never have given those audiences was absolutely as important as Radio 4.
Isn't there an argument, however, that this could be regarded as sort of slightly back to front, that you have a licence fee mechanism which goes back to the 1920s, which brings with it the requirement to give everything to somebody, we all pay, therefore we must all get. So I suppose the question is universality a genuine social good, or is it really just a consequence of a funding mechanism that was a bit of an accident because the newspapers didn't want competition in the advertising market back in 1923?
Well, even if it weren't, and I think it is, even if it weren't, the argument would still hold good. The audiences for popular programming of all sorts deserve to be served with the quality and the range that the BBC gives them. There is, however, the one really, really difficult argument about the BBC, and I'm basically a big fan of the BBC, the one really difficult argument is the one you touched on. Is the public interest more focused on the BBC supplying its high-quality, free services as widely as it possibly can, or is the public interest better served by an open, competitive marketplace, which undoubtedly the BBC inhibits? Now, the balance between those two things is a real issue.
So you think the BBC does inhibit the market?
Of course it does.
Trevor?
Well, like everybody else, despite my News UK provenance, I'm a great fan of the BBC. I've been listening to it all my life. But I think that there's no doubt that it tries to cover the whole boardwalk and anything that pops up as an area that it might take over. For instance, the internet, which I think is much too big an operation.
We will come to that. But go on.
But on almost everything, radio news, I understand that the BBC commands 75% of radio news and 75% of television news. And that's a huge slice of the market. And it crowds out local newspapers, it crowds out local broadcasters.
James Pennell, can I ask you, do you think that the BBC in the modern age is still at the kind of creative centre of the businesses it inhabits? Because the world has changed so dramatically. Hundreds of channels, if not thousands, the internet, independent production sector making award-winning programmes, including Bake Off, made by an indie, all over the shop. Is the BBC any longer the centre of the universe?
We're not the centre of the universe, but I think we are one of the key reasons why Britain is so good at creativity. And actually, an interesting thing about Charter Review this time is I've never seen such a consensus from the industry about the vital role of the BBC in taking risks, in inventing new formats, in working with the indie sector, absolutely, with things like Bake Off, but also making wonderful in-house shows like Strictly or Doctor Who. So yes, if you look 20 or 30 years ago, a fifth or a third of our programmes on BBC One in peak were acquisitions, nearly all American. Now it's none. You know, we do take other formats every now and then and reinvent them in a BBC way. The Voice, The Apprentice, University Challenge, Dragon's Den. That's all that there is, and that's a complete difference.
Well, we also have here Sanjay Singhal. He's an independent producer who runs Voltage Productions and has previously made One Born Every Minute and much else besides for Channel 4. Just on this question, Sanjay, from where you sit, is the BBC still at the centre of in TV at least, of the creative world?
I think absolutely, and on this particular question about what the BBC should and shouldn't do, I can't think of any other organisation that would define itself by what it shouldn't be doing. But at the same time, there's lots of drama being made on other channels, Amazon, Netflix, ITV, Sky. There's no shortage of drama being made. Does that mean the BBC should stop commissioning original drama? And who's to say that those programmes will continue to get made on other channels in the future? You can't define an organisation by the programmes it thinks other people will fill the market for. You define it by saying, our aspiration is to make the best programmes in its genre for our audience, and I think it's very dangerous to try to limit that ambition. OK, we're also joined by David Elstein, who's a broadcasting executive, formerly of Thames TV, Sky and Channel 5, and is now chairman of the Open Democracy website. In your view, does the BBC really need to do everything it currently does? Is it distinctive enough?
I don't think the BBC is ambitious enough in its content. It cedes the ground to the major US broadcasters in terms of highest quality drama and openly admits that it's doing so. It spends too much of its money on relatively low ambition shows. But personally, I don't have any problem with the BBC doing whatever it wants to do if that's what its audience wants. I wish it were funded in a voluntary fashion rather than a compulsory fashion, because then politicians would be eliminated from the whole process.
But moving on briefly to market impact, that's the effect the BBC has on its competitors, old and new. Here's what John Whittingdale said when I asked him about the sharp end of the BBC's impact, local newspapers and its online presence.
The problems of the newspapers go way beyond the BBC, but they express a firm view that the fact that you can access content which looks like long-form journalism on the BBC website is clearly something they are unhappy about, and raises this question as to whether or not the BBC should be essentially entering the printed news market, and that, I think, is a legitimate concern for them to express.
So is there a case then, do you think, for the BBC to consider whether everything it does online is strictly necessary?
Yeah, well, I think there is a strong case for the BBC to look at their online provision and say, is this simply making available the kind of news provision which we have traditionally done? But if they are then going beyond that to provide news content which looks like newspapers, then that is where I think the newspapers are entitled to express concern.
So, Liz Forgan, you've been here. You've been there, so to speak.
Yes.
What's your view about where newspapers stand? Do they have a proper cause for complaint or not?
Yes, they do. They have a proper cause for grumbling, but the question is, what's the solution? And I think the solution is not to stop the BBC doing things. It's to try and figure out a way where the investment that the nation makes in the BBC, in one of the world's most extraordinary news-gathering machines, for example, can be shared better with the rest of the nation. BBC is absolutely hopeless at sharing.
But look, Liz, have you seen any evidence, concrete evidence, to suggest that the BBC has this crowding out or damaging effect to newspaper websites? I ask you that because the newspaper's own research, Oliver and Oldbaum, the Newspaper Marketing Association, they came out with the same, that they tried and could only conclude that at some point in the future it might be an issue. And indeed, the Trust have produced some research from KPMG just a couple of weeks ago, which pretty well says the same thing. No one's found any evidence. I know people in newspapers feel it deeply and genuinely. Is there any evidence that you've seen?
Well, I think the local and regional press question is not the right place to start. That was in free fall before the BBC really cranked itself up. But all I can tell you is that working from inside a newspaper, I have sat at more than one meeting where people were considering embarking on a new piece of territory, and the presence of the BBC ended up being a real disincentive to doing it. You sit there and you say, somebody is providing a brilliant version of this service for nothing. How do we make a business out of it? The question is, where does the public's interest best lie? Not necessarily in a free market and squashing the BBC.
James Purnell, so is there room for concession here? Is part of your Charter review pitch, do you think, likely to include, or could it include, something by way of a concession or an acknowledgement of the difficulties that newspapers face in terms of your own online presence?
I mean, the newspaper industry in the UK, for all the challenges, is actually probably doing better than any in the world. We got 2 of the 3 biggest newspaper websites in the world, got fantastic innovation. The BBC, I think, has to be very careful about making sure that we intervene in this market in a way that creates growth overall. But actually, the UK has been pretty good at this, and it's partly because the BBC innovated news online back in the 1990s. Not just that, but partly that.
So, if that's opened up some of the issues about what the BBC should do and should be, how should it be financed? Can the licence fee system introduced way back in the 1920s really be right for the 2020s? Well, we have a question from a member of our audience, Angela Walker.
How will the BBC encourage young people to fund the BBC in future, given that a good proportion of them don't actually watch television?
I should add to that Secretary of State John Whittingdale has previously said he thinks that the licence fee is, quote, worse than a poll tax and ultimately unsustainable. David Elstein.
I just think the BBC unnecessarily limits itself by excluding itself from the voluntary subscription marketplace, which is easily the most dynamic around. It could
do you see any
generate
downside
far
to that?
more money, make far better programmes, make far more programmes through a voluntary system. But I agree with Greg. You still need publicly funded, market failure content. I would rather see a contestable public fund, as recommended by Lord Burns.
So, but by which you mean where anyone could apply to it if they're doing public service broadcasting?
Okay. But I would hate to see the BBC getting out of the public service content business. I'd love to see the BBC doing much better drama, much more comedy, much more entertainment programming, paid for voluntarily by people who are shown willingness to do so.
Okay.
There's overwhelming evidence for that.
Richard Eyre,
Well,
it
David,
sounds fabulous.
You wouldn't believe this from reading the BBC's competitors in the press, but more people support the licence fee now than they did 10 years ago when the last charter was being debated. 53% of licence fee payers, when given the whole range of ways of paying for the BBC, direct government funding, licence fee, subscription, advertising, 53% say they prefer the licence fee. 16% say they would like some sort of subscription, maybe a basic licence fee for a basic service, then topped up with subscription for extra services. But wait, that 16% disappears down into single digits when you ask them a question, which bits of it do you want free at the point of use, and which bits do you want to pay for? And guess what? They all want the things that they like from the BBC to be the free bit, and the bits they don't like to be paid for by somebody else.
All fair points, but why does that make subscription a worse option for funding the BBC in the longer term? Surely it would give the BBC, as David says, freedom from politicians. The BBC could set its own price. It would, we'll come on to this question in a second, it would solve the decriminalisation issue because nobody could be prosecuted for not paying. They pay if they don't want to. What's the problem with going down that line?
Very easy. It absolutely undermines the principle of universality. And David and people who advocate subscription know that it undermines the... They know that it undermines the basis of the BBC.
Trevor Kavanagh, do you think that most of your readers are as content as Richard's and the BBC Trust survey suggests they might be with paying the licence fee?
Well, I think Richard's survey is about as reliable as those opinion polls before elections when people are asked if they'd pay more tax, and they say absolutely, and then they vote for the party that wants to cut taxes and cut welfare. But I think it's outrageous that people are forced by law to pay for a service that they may not watch. And I think there are better ways of doing it.
Which brings us very neatly, it's plainly one potential downside of the licence fee. And for a start, many thousands of people are criminalised each year for failing to pay the licence fee. Andrew Bridgen is MP for North West Leicestershire. He's been campaigning hard on this issue. Andrew, you've said that the licence fee is an anachronism that discriminates against the poorest in society. What's your view of what you've heard so far?
Well, I'd just put it to your panel and your audience that if the BBC were to discover a banana republic who announced that they were going to inflict a poll tax upon their population for the right to view television today, and back that up with criminal sanctions if you didn't pay the tax, and that 73% of the people criminalised were going to be women, the BBC quite rightly would be an outrage. But that's the situation we currently have in the UK today.
Now, your campaign built up quite a head of steam, a cross-party head of steam, I think it's fair to say, and everyone was getting very concerned about doing something about it. The government commissioned a review by a QC called Perry, I think, if I've got the name right, and he came to the conclusion that doing what you'd suggested, which was decriminalising, would result in a significant increase, such a significant increase in evasion that the BBC would be left, as it were, seriously out of pocket. Now, it feels as if your campaign has kind of slightly stalled. Where do you feel that it's at now?
Well, yes, I gave evidence to David Perry, but I think it was the commercial consideration of the cost of decriminalisation and the collection of debts for the BBC.
Do you have any other obvious option or solution other than full-on subscription?
I think there's a huge opportunity out there in the commercial market for subscription. Radio is more of a problem. I think about £30 put on council tax would cover the radio aspect, but BBC TV should go subscription as soon as possible. It is absolutely unsustainable going forward to have a funding mechanism for the BBC TV predicated on the watching of terrestrial television live, because that is not going to happen. It's not sustainable now, it's not sustainable in 5 years, and also I believe that charter renewal should only be for 5 years because technology is moving so fast. 10 years ago we didn't have iPads, we didn't have smartphones. What will we have in 10 years' time? And I think 5 years charter renewal is long enough.
OK, Andrew Bridgen, many thanks indeed. The last two licence fee settlements, both effectively imposed on the BBC, one in 2010 and the one that James Bennell just referred to last July, when the government took away the government grant, around $700 million a year, paid to the BBC on account of over 75's licence fees. Both those settlements have been widely condemned as virtually unconstitutional. Now, Richard Eyre, you're a long-standing member of the BBC Trust. You were there for both of them. But what is your view of these two events?
Well, they were both unsatisfactory. Clearly, the second one was more unsatisfactory than the first, because we all, in the BBC, in the BBC Trust and in government, were preparing after a general election, whichever government came to power, we were prepared to start negotiating the function of the BBC, what it's there to do, its size and scale, and therefore what public funding it might require. But the first thing that hits the BBC and the BBC Trust after the election is not the debate about size and scale and scope, what we should be there to do, but this is the amount of money that you will have to do it with, and a 700 or thereabout £700 million a year cut by giving the BBC responsible for what was introduced as a government policy of paying for over 75's licences.
Do you see why that makes the BBC look very close to the government, or at least amenable to government pressure, or even a government raid, if you like, in a way that is really quite unhelpful when you're trying to say, no, we are the BBC, we are independent, we are there for you?
It doesn't give the impression that the government is amenable, that the BBC is amenable to government. Clearly, once every 10 years when the Charter is debated, the BBC is amenable to government. That's why there should be a proper public debate about what the audience expects of the BBC.
But twice
on this
the
occasion, the money was determined by government before the debate.
On the subject of which, after the deal in July, the BBC said that, I'm going to paraphrase here, it was a dreadfully difficult deal, done in appalling circumstances, but it might have been a better outcome than it could otherwise have been, because the BBC got some things back. They also said that this meant that the financial size of the BBC was settled, and that was the key to the deal. In other words, it gave the BBC a degree of certainty. Well, here's what Secretary of State John Whittingdale told me when I put it to him that what he'd condemned as wholly wrong in the 2010 deal, when he was chair of the Media Select Committee, he had in effect done himself as a minister in July.
What happened in July was not the licence fee settlement. We've made it quite clear that the decision as to the future level of the licence fee is connected with Charter Review, where we are having a full public consultation in which everybody is invited to express a view. The decision taken in July was about the necessity of getting down the amount of government spending, particularly in the welfare budget. And it was the case that the DWP was having to write every year a very sizable cheque to the BBC to compensate them for free TV licences for those over 75. So it was understandable that the Chancellor, who was looking to find savings in the welfare budget, would regard that as a legitimate area to ask for savings to be made.
But again, it was done in exactly the way that you and your committee said it shouldn't be.
Well,
it was behind closed doors. There was no public or parliamentary consultation.
But this was a decision about government spending, and that is something which the Chancellor has to do, and he had to do so rapidly because we've made it clear. The licence fee settlement is part of Charter Review. We made it clear that the licence fee, the future level of licence fee would be dependent on the outcome of Charter Review, and that is something where there is very full public consultation.
Well, except that the BBC say, they said in writing in response to the licence fee settlement, that now that the financial size, I think was the term they used, of the BBC is settled, and that the government accepts that, then everybody has a kind of planning assumption that's valid for the next 5-7 years. Are you saying that's not right?
Well, what I'm saying is that the letter which the Chancellor and I set out the agreement with the BBC makes it clear that actually the future level of the licence fee is dependent on the outcome of Charter Review. We said that the BBC could expect for the licence fee to begin to rise in line with prices at the beginning of the next charter, on the basis that, firstly, we would expect the BBC still to find the same efficiencies as other public bodies, but also depending upon decisions taken in the charter renewal process.
So this is still an open question?
It is an open question in that the final decision about the size and scope of the BBC and its purposes are questions that we are deciding as part of charter renewal.
So when the BBC said, as they did in the wake of the licence fee settlement, that the financial size of the BBC, I think words they used, is now settled, that's wrong.
No, what is the correct position is that as spelt out in the letter from the Chancellor and myself, which sets out the terms of the agreement, and that makes it perfectly clear that the licence fee level is dependent upon the outcome of charter renewal.
So it's not settled by the licence fee deal?
No, it will be settled as part of the charter review process.
So, James Purnell, Tony Hall from the BBC told staff in the wake of the settlement, and I'll repeat it one more time, the government and the BBC now consider that the financial size of the BBC is set with a fixed financial baseline over the next charter period. He's just said it's not settled. What do you make of that?
Well, you're obviously giving him a typically forensic set of questions, and it sounds like he could just be saying what the Secretary of State has always said, which is the letter says the size of the BBC and its finances is set unless we change not the size but the purpose and scope of the BBC. And our understanding is that, quite properly, if the government decided to fundamentally change the BBC, then of course the money would need to be looked at again. If the government decides, we shouldn't do anything outside of the UK or we shouldn't have radio, of course at that stage you would want to look at it. But our understanding is that absent that, then we've agreed and done the licence fee deal in
He's actually saying it's not a licence fee deal. He's saying it's a government funding deal because they were paying the BBC on account of over 75 licence fees. That they had their election promises to make. They've got their deficit to sort out. It was a government fund. It's not. He's actually said there this is not a licence fee deal.
If there is an intention to have a different licence fee settlement after that, then that would be a departure. That would be quite a change from the letter. I think we would have to have a hard think about that. I think we would probably say at that point all of the costs in that agreement would then have to go into the licence fee settlement. You then have to look at, the over 75s, etc. But I don't think that's what he's saying.
Just to be clear, if what he means is that there is no licence fee settlement, that will not exist in any meaningful form at all until charter review is done and dusted.
Yeah.
If that's what he's saying, then as far as you're concerned, the deal that's done in July is all up for grabs.
Yeah, we've reached an agreement on our finances absent a fundamental change. If the government decides it wants to have a further licence fee discussion, you'd have to look at all of the elements which are up for grabs, both extra costs and extra income. So you'd have to start all over again. I genuinely trying to listen very carefully to what he was saying. I don't think that's what he was saying.
Richard Eyre.
Well, I'm absolutely at one with James here. Our understanding was, absent any significant change in what the BBC is required to do as a result of charter renewal, the licence fee has now been determined and the RPI increase the licence fee has now been determined. Now, if there were to be, as a result of charter renewal, despite the fact that there is no apparent public appetite for it, but if there were to be some major change in the size and scope of the BBC and what it is permitted to do, then clearly the discussions we had over licence fee would have to be had again and everything would be back on the table.
But he has very clearly said that that's not a licence fee deal.
That is what he said in this interview, yes.
OK. Which brings us rather neatly, and finally you might be pleased to hear, it brings us rather neatly to how the BBC is governed. Can you be confident that your money is being spent wisely and efficiently, and that the BBC has structures that do in fact protect it from government interference? There was a system, a board of governors, that lasted for nearly 80 years, which was then changed at the last charter review, when a new BBC trust was created. But a series of public scandals and mishaps over executive payoffs, Jimmy Savile, the failed digital media initiative, which cost the BBC over £100 million, have left the BBC trust looking, well, bust. But it might also tell us that changing it, that is the BBC's system of governance, is fraught with difficulty. Here's what John Whittingdale thinks about the BBC Trust.
I think you'd be very hard put to find anybody who doesn't think it needs to be improved. The Select Committee was quite clear in its report that the BBC Trust had not worked, but I don't think anybody would expect the BBC and its Trust in its present form to survive completely unchanged.
Are you envisaging that the Charter will be 10 years?
That's one of the questions, which is in the Green Paper. I have not got any preconceived idea that it should be shorter, but it's a legitimate question to consider.
Liz Forgan.
The BBC needs two things. It needs a policeman and it needs a champion. And they can't both be the same person, which is what they were once upon a time. The Trust was an attempt to separate the two, but without actually screwing up enough courage to have an effective external regulator. And I think that's the problem. And I think the time has come for that now. It might be Ofcom, but it would require Ofcom to be very substantially changed to make it work. If it Ofbib or some sort, but an external regulator, and then a powerful champion, not some kind of commercial board, a powerful champion who would defend the independence of the BBC, and which, for example, would have had no truck with that midnight raid on the £700 million.
Well, we also have with us Tim Souter, who was a BBC executive many years ago, but has since been at Ofcom and was head of broadcasting at the DCMS during a previous charter review. Tim, you've done a lot of work on these sorts of structures. What's your view about the Trust?
Well, I think Liz is right. I think it was born of an understandable desire to separate those things out, but it actually left a situation where there was no clear leadership. The division between who set the strategy, who was responsible for the remit, who was going to regulate it, all got rather confused. And actually we have to go back to something that is much simpler, which is that we need a strong, independent leadership of the BBC that is clearly and unambiguously there to deliver the remit that Parliament sets for it every 10 years and then needs to be told to get on with the job and defend the independence of the BBC. And I think you need a regulator who is there effectively to ensure that minimum standards are maintained and that there is no greater encroachment on the freedom of expression than is absolutely justified.
Richard Eyre, you've been on the Trust for quite a long time now. You've been there through many of the things that would now be regarded as mishaps, perhaps less politely put, crises. Is there any reason to worry, do you think, do any of you think, about changing the system of governance again?
I take no pride in saying this, but I worked in the BBC 44 years ago, and for the first 20 or 30 years as a member of the BBC, I spent quite a lot of time as I got up the greasy pole trying to run rings around the governors to make sure they didn't find out what they should properly have known. It's clearly a different age we're in.
Says the BBC's former controller of editorial policy, I should say.
We live in a different age where it is entirely right that an organisation that gets billions of pounds of public money every year should be held to account externally by somebody that is not a part of the BBC. That is not only inevitable, it's right.
Trevor.
It seems to me as an outsider, and I think to many others outside the BBC, that actually nobody is in command of this operation at all. Not Tony Hall, probably not in his day Greg Dyke. It's too big, it's too amorphous, it's too bureaucratic, and it reminds me much more of the NHS than it does a broadcasting service. It seems to have a sense of entitlement. £3.7 billion. Not a single word that James or Richard have uttered tonight suggests there's any amenable attitude by the BBC towards the government whatsoever. They could happily have £10 billion and they'd still fight for it next time around. They would spend every penny and they would spend it badly.
James Purnell, briefly.
In 10 years' time, you'll have a BBC which still has wonderful stations like Radio 4, all of our radio stations, our TV channels. I think those will still be going strong, but they will have been matched by a series of internet services which will probably be just as big a part of what the BBC delivers.
OK.